For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for more updates.
Did you know that worldwide solar investments grew at the rate of 15% per annum in the last 5 years? Did you know that solar investments in 22 worldwide was $308 billion? Did you know that this is 52% of the total investment in renewables across the world? Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I'm your host, Anil Padmanabhan. Exactly 8 years ago, India teamed up with France and set up the International Solar Alliance, or the ISA, on the first day of the COP meet in Paris. Indeed, it was a defining moment. It led to the reinvention of India's climate persona. It went from being a perennial naysayer or a party pooper to a country which was perceived as a willing partner in the battle against climate change. In fact, India has never looked back since then. Last week, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who was here at the COP summit in Dubai, offered that India will host the 2028 COP meet in New Delhi. Indeed, how did this ISA end up being such a defining moment for India? More importantly, has it lived up to the hype? To answer all this and more, we spoke to Vyoma Jha, who is the India Clean Energy Senior Advocate at the National Resources Defence Council. Vyoma is a scholar who has worked on the ISA and has in fact got a forthcoming book on the subject. Hence, a perfect expert to delve on our concerns and questions. We began by asking Vyoma about the 8th anniversary of the ISA and the motivation for India to set it up.
I think there were two underlying factors to why India decided to announce the International Solar Alliance in the Paris climate talks. The first really stems from the fact that India had seen a dramatic decrease in the prices of solar energy that year, which had also led subsequently to a ramping up of India's solar energy targets from a target of 22 gigawatts by the year 2022 to up to 100 gigawatts of solar power by 2022. And this really came on the back of an experimentation in India on a new business model for these new technologies, particularly in two sectors, which was LED bulbs as well as solar PV electricity. And this new business model combined the idea of demand aggregation with bulk procurement. So India's large, vast, growing markets were able to absorb the sort of initial high costs of these new technologies, and the growing volumes in turn subsequently were bringing prices down. So seeing this success story really in the solar sector, I think gave India the inkling that it could be a model that could be replicated in other parts of the developing world, which still struggle with, the issue of energy access as well as a low carbon sustainable growth. And particularly countries in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, which then really formed the sort of member countries of the ISA, the so-called sort of sunshine or solar-rich countries that they identified as member countries. The second broad motivation for India to pursue this really was, just the fact that leading up to the Paris climate talks, India was under intense scrutiny for its role in either securing or blocking a global climate deal. So the Indian establishment was keen to display that, they were serious about domestic climate targets and domestic climate commitments, especially with the ramping up of the solar energy targets. But they also wanted to play a slightly more proactive role at the international stage. And creating a new alliance or a new organization sort of focused solely on the solar deployment needs in the developing world where it is needed the most, was really an opportune moment for India to, to use the Paris climate talks to announce this. And doing so in partnership with France, which was the host country for that year's climate talks, was again, an advantage that India sort of made the most of, and really sort of made a high level announcement on day one of the talks, which would set a positive tone for the rest of the 2 weeks that culminated in the adoption of the Paris Agreement.
So, Vima, India clearly made a virtue out of a necessity there and showed certain level of adroitness. But isn't this also coming out moment for Indian diplomacy? Because, like you pointed out, they were perceived as a deal blocker or a naysayer. But this was a kind of pivot from where it transitioned to this proactive role. What are your thoughts?
Well, I would not characterize India as a perennial naysayer. I think that stems really a lot from the fact that India has traditionally taken a position which rests on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. Simply put, the idea that the developed world really should take the lead on climate action, and any measures by developing countries should be supported by finance and technology transfer from the developed world. So India was instrumental in constructing the idea around differentiated responsibility in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it really sort of held this position in several years of the climate negotiations, and sometime to its detriment, really, because I think those were the years where India ended up being labeled as spoilsport or a naysayer. But Paris was different. Paris was a really sort of landmark year in the sense that India went into Paris with a sort of renewed sense of what its interests were, and I really think that that was the year that India was able to articulate its interests in a much more sort of confident and collaborative manner. So I argue in some of my writing that Paris, or the sort of creation or announcement of the International Solar Alliance at the Paris Climate Talks, marked a shift in Indian policy, foreign policy, where climate change becomes a point of consideration for furthering India's strategic interests. And in this case, those are two. One being, the idea of taking on a leadership role in a climate adjacent space, specifically solar energy, and the second being asserting greater global power by the creation of a new international organization. And I think this is what India was able to do very confidently at Paris, which is why it was a very different year in terms of just India's negotiating posture.
Interesting. So, what you're saying is that basically India went from playing defense to a more proactive role in trying to assume some leadership position in its own way. So, how did this impact the global perception of India, which, like you said, had been molded around India being considered a naysayer?
Well, I think globally there really was a reshaping of the perception, around India's role in climate action. I think countries certainly started seeing India as a more proactive and engaged player around issues of climate change. It was willing to discuss climate change across multiple forums. It was also deepening its engagement on climate and clean energy in different bilateral, minilateral, or multilateral frameworks. And and in addition to that, in addition to just the global perception, I think India was also demonstrating a new kind of, proactive sort of stance on specific issue-based areas around climate change. So, in addition to the announcement and creation of the International Solar Alliance, India has also announced the CDRI, which is the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. It has announced the leadership group for industry transition alongside Sweden, which essentially brings public as well as private players to reduce carbon emissions in heavy industries. This year itself, India at the G20 summit announced the Global Biofuel Alliance to promote the demand and supply for biofuels, announced jointly with the United States and Brazil. And most recently, on the first day of COP28 in Dubai, India, along with the UAE presidency, has gone on to announce the global green credit initiative. And I think all of this really illustrates India's sort of proactive stance on figuring out what its interests are across a variety of issue areas, and really creating and carving out new spaces, which would address these interests.
Interesting. So you're saying implicit in all this is that there's a horses for courses strategy that India is adopting instead of putting all its eggs in one basket, say the UNFCCC. So just want to tag a news development which happened yesterday where the Prime Minister pitched for the COP 20 in 2028 to be hosted by India. How does all of this segue into what we just discussed?
I think the announcement by India to be hosting COP 30, COP 33 in 2028 is a very welcome announcement, and it's a clear signal that India is not going to renege on its climate commitments. I definitely read this as, a very confident sort of posturing by India to make sure that it is perceived as a country which will continue on its clean energy ambitions as well as its net zero goals, and not really sort of abandon those. And the other reason that this is a crucial year is that the Paris Agreement and the commitments under the Paris Agreement last until the year 2030. So 2028, in that sense, is going to be a critical year in the climate talks where the next global climate deal will be fleshed out. And I think the fact that India has announced its intention to be the host country that year, it can be understood as an intention for India to be counted as an important player in the climate conversation, as well as be an important player in really shaping the post 2030 climate agenda.
Going back to the International Solar Alliance and your own research work in that area, you make a very pertinent observation that the Solar Alliance actually covers the band of countries that fall between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. Coincidentally, most of them are developing countries. So, does this leverage of a new green geography give India a greater chance of being the voice of the global south, particularly because solar tech is something which is doable at eminently lower costs compared to other alternatives?
Yes, I do agree with that assessment that it is, an example, really perhaps the most concrete example of India trying to become a bigger voice for the global south. And really, I think what is unique about the International Solar Alliance and the way in which it was created is that India was able to identify an opportunity for addressing the most urgent needs of energy access and a low carbon sort of sustainable growth in these countries, which, although are poor developing countries in the world, have a high potential for deployment of solar energy. So it's a curious case of being solar rich, but sort of poor and developing countries. And according to the sort of initial outlining of who the member states were, the solar poor countries were the sort of wealthy developed nations of the world, which did not necessarily fall within the tropics, but outside of that. So, in a sense, by creating this new geography of sunshine states, India has, in a sense, flipped the narrative on where solar deployment should occur. So instead of a few countries which really had the monopoly of both, solar manufacturing as well as solar deployment, this has suddenly created a new coalition and a new grouping of countries where you have the maximum potential for deployment of solar energy, and clearly the maximum need for finance and technology to flow into, and given the sort of unique legal form of the International Solar Alliance, which I describe as a soft law in a hard shell. It sort of retains the treaty structure of an international organization, and it gives the sovereign rights to the solar resource rich countries to decide how the deployment should occur. And yet, the sort of softer provisions, give the flexibility to nations as well as non-state actors to carry out the implementation and also to channelize money into solar deployment in these regions through new and innovative sources of financing, primarily from financial institutions as well as the private sector. So I think it is a unique sort of innovation in international rulemaking where you are seeing this flexible multilateralism play out, where where a new institution is responding to the needs of the developing world, and yet it is relying on the infrastructure as well as the capabilities of the developed world as well as the non-state and sort of private actors to drive the ambition as well as implementation forward.
Finally, Vyoma, the ISA has just clocked 8 years. Has it lived up to its hype, particularly with respect to generating the funds required to install these facilities in the global south?
To your question of whether it has lived up to the hype, I would respond in yes and no. I feel like it has lived up to the hype in the sense that it is now a treaty-based international organization. Many people wrote it off after the Paris announcement as just being a high-level announcement and not much more. But really, it is testament to India's diplomacy as well as just efforts in steering the treaty making process that led to the creation of ISA as a legal entity a year after its announcement. That really is perhaps one illustration of how it had lived up to the hype. Also, it is very global in its scope. It's not only India focused. So it is working and expanding in areas that it had intended to. A lot of the ICA's activities around advocacy, capacity building, as well as diplomatic support extend in LDCs, as well as small island states across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. So, in that sense, it is a heartening fact that it is not merely an India centric organization, but rather truly global. In terms of no, I will agree with your assessment that finance remains the missing link. The ICA was announced with the sort of grand ambition of mobilizing $1 trillion of finance for massive solar deployment in the developing world by 2030, but it falls woefully short of that number. India and France remain the only two major contributors to the ICA's corpus, and that number also sort of is in the billions and far away from the sort of big ambition of $1 trillion by 2030.
In the final analysis, it is clear that the co-creation of the International Solar Alliance by India was a defining, or rather coming out moment for Indian climate diplomacy. For one, it allowed India to rewrite the narrative about itself. Second, by creating the International Solar Alliance, India was able to work around the gridlock that has been forced on multilateral institutions by superpower rivalries. Third, by creating the ISA, India managed to unbundle the fight against climate change and, even better, make the global south a partner in it. And then it also showcased India's ability at institutional entrepreneurship on the global stage. All in all, it has been a great start for the ISA and for India's climate diplomacy. But needless to say, it's a task half finished. Guess it is time to sign off from COP Dubai then. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Strat News Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please to share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions with us. I'm available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.